Recently we talked about art imitating life in Madeline's Madeline. And recently I saw another film coming into the Loft Cinema here locally. As you can tell, I'm a big fan. And they're showing a movie called At Eternity's Gate, which stars Willem Dafoe as Vincent van Gogh. It's an unfortunate rhyme, but it's true. We saw the film a few days ago, and well, I guess we're gonna paint you a picture of how that film was.
I don't know what to say.
Let's get this out of the way right up front. Willem Dafoe is a really, really good actor. Of course, we know him from such films as Antichrist. We know him from such films as The Boondock Saints. There was a firefight. And obviously, we all know him from the 80s classic, Streets of Fire. I'm a big fan of Willem Dafoe.
It was Christ, for the love of God.
He was really, really good. I struggled because he looks a lot like he looks a lot like Willem Dafoe. He looks a lot like Vincent van Gogh. And he does a really good job in this movie, but at times I just kind of felt like it was just Willem Dafoe. It's hard to not see Willem Dafoe as Willem Dafoe. Up front, though, some of the best things about his performance is he brings a lot of vulnerability to Vincent van Gogh, and it really speaks to his range as an actor. And Van Gogh is, for the most part, a very sympathetic character. Now, I, like most people, know of Van Gogh's work, and I've heard a lot of the stories. So I went into it with a lot of knowledge about Van Gogh. Not a stupendous amount. I'm not an art major. I have a job. And really what the film deals with is Van Gogh's career from when he's in Paris and he's convinced to go to the south of France to find a new environment. And that's probably the most interesting dynamic of the film, is that Van Gogh is consistently looking for something in the environment to inspire him. What this really helps to do up front is establish Van Gogh as somebody who is really trying to observe the world. And that's very important because it's also a character who struggles with his perception of reality. He's definitely mentally ill, he's struggling to keep it together, and this film deals with that at several points. He'll act out sometimes, he's incredibly emotional and volatile. And when we talked about Madeline's Madeline, what I complained about was I really never had a sense of who the character was or what their motivations were. And this film doesn't have any of those problems. Van Gogh, from the beginning, is definitely someone who is obsessed with their art. And even when they deal with other characters, for the most part, he's almost like the man who fell to earth. He's kind of like an alien to these people who, while very interesting and charismatic in his own right, is definitely somebody who can't really form a genuine connection. Some of the interesting characters in this film are obviously Theo van Gogh. Is it Theo van Gogh, or is that the guy that murdered someone? I think Theo van Gogh murdered someone. That's not correct in the slightest. It's Vincent van Gogh and his brother. We'll just call him Theo.
I think Theo was murdered.
I think Theo's a murderer.
No, he was murdered.
Theo van Gogh was murdered?
I believe he was murdered.
Theo van Gogh was killed.
No, you're thinking of the Dutch film director, not Danish, but Dutch, was killed.
Okay, well, Theo van Gogh was his brother.
Who do you think of Sirhan?
Oh my God, I am.
Are you serious?
Yeah. I have a job. Van Gogh didn't make a lot of money from his paintings, and he really didn't become famous until after his death. However, he is famous in the south of France during this picture because of his outbursts. And a lot of those come a little bit before, but mostly after Oscar Isaac departs from him. And what was interesting about this sequence and that relationship is the relationship between the two painters is probably the only time that you really see Vincent actually developing a connection with somebody, because obviously the connection with his brother is already established. And Oscar Isaac plays an interesting foil to Van Gogh. He's somebody who believes in the art revolutionary, someone who really believes that the nature of art is a statement to itself. And there's a lot of really cool contrasts, specifically how he criticizes Van Gogh for painting too fast, for his style of painting. And at one point he points out one of the most interesting things about Van Gogh's art, which is that sometimes it looks more like a clay sculpture than it does paint on canvas because of how fast it happens, and he's leaving globs of glue on the paint. Wow, none of that was right. I just Sirhan that story. Wow, I am struggling today. He leaves globs of paint on the canvas like marks of clay. Now what's interesting is that while Van Gogh struggles to connect with other people, they do give him a voiceover between certain scenes to interact with the audience. And I've talked before about how a voiceover can be a very powerful way of getting inside of a character's head and kind of understanding what their motivations are. And for Van Gogh, the voiceover really comes across as trying to help you understand how alone he feels in the world and how he as a person feels in relationship to the people around him. He doesn't actually talk a lot about the art form in those voiceovers. And I think that was an interesting choice However, a lot of the dialogue between him and other characters, especially as the film goes on and he becomes more troubled and needs more allies, is him espousing his artistic and aesthetic philosophies. And sometimes when a character says in dialogue, I see things the way nobody else does, or my view and my art is something important that people need to see, it can come across as arrogant. There was an interesting opportunity to have those voiceovers play in a bit closer in proximity to moments of his artwork and creation to kind of bridge the gap between what he's doing is really a unique interpretation of the world rather than him just explicitly stating it to other characters. The story is very interesting, and sometimes it actually felt like when Gus Van Sant would do those movies like Last Days, like those quasi-documentaries about Cobain and such, where it's the last few months of Van Gogh's life, and it's some long sequences of just him walking in the forests and on the mountains and really trying to just find beauty in the world that he can capture. And while those moments where you feel like a voyeur observing him can be very effective, sometimes you can feel a bit lost, or they happen in such quick succession that you just feel like it's a little overwhelming sometimes, and you're really missing some sort of character interaction, or just something that provides context or substance for what the character is getting out of it, because without that, it feels sometimes like the audience gets nothing out of it. And as I always say, what's interesting about this is it does deal with the good and the bad. And quite frankly, it doesn't really deal with good per se so much as just him at stasis, him at a baseline, and him just living his life. And the bad is bad. You never really feel like he's a malevolent person, but he is a chaotic person. One of the best scenes in this movie to me is when he has been taken away from the city and he's in sort of this mental home run by these priests. He has an encounter with Mads Mikkelsen, who does a fantastic job. It's hands down the best scene in this movie. And it's really an inquisition, no pun intended, that was a really loaded phrase. Nobody expects the Mikkelsen Inquisition. But the interaction between these two people and Mikkelsen really asking, what is your art? Why are you an artist? What is the nature of your art? And who are you as a person in relation to God, to aesthetics? And I'm not really a theological person, but the discussion between those two characters was really insightful as to how Van Gogh saw himself, probably more so than any other point or conversation in the movie. And it is interesting because, again, it's not as if these two characters have anything in common personally, but they do find a way to bridge that gap through theology and through art. A few things that I would like to critique are more from a production standpoint. One is that the score is good, but it's a little bit limited. They recycle the same song at several points. And while that's not a huge issue, sometimes they'll cue the song to begin a scene or to show a reaction to something. And while that can be effective, once you become familiar with it, it kind of sounds like the Peanuts Christmas song in Arrested Development.
Tell me, why do you say you're a painter?
The other thing I would say is it's as artistic of a film visually as it is in terms of content. In other words, the camera work is very creative. It's a lot of long shots, handheld, and when he's out in the woods and he's running or he's painting, those things are very effective. But there are some longer scenes, like when Van Gogh is talking with, I think it's Gagnon, who's played by Oscar Isaac, in this church, and Dafoe sprints out in an outburst, and the camera's now running after him. It feels a bit Blair Witch. At some points, it's too shaky to really pick out what's happening, and then when they finally reset and go back to a single shot, like the camera guy is like going like right up into his face, and then at one point he'll like drop to the ground to get a low angle. You kind of see like these little moments where they'll slightly tweak the camera to fix it or center him, and it just feels like you're watching somebody with the camera shoot Willem Dafoe playing Vincent van Gogh. However, there are some scenes where that camera work and getting really up close and personal with these characters and traveling around in big swooping shots actually adds a lot of intimacy. So it was kind of a mixed bag from that perspective. And it's a really good example of how visual camera work can actually say just as much about a character and their emotions as dialogue can, as music can, and as a script can. The biggest thing at the end of the day for me was it definitely left me understanding who Van Gogh was. It definitely left me sort of understanding more about how he came to paint things the way that he did. And it helped me understand how he saw the world and tried to display it through art. And maybe to an extent, he actually saw art through the world more so than the world through anything else. It's an interesting film. It's well acted. It's well paced. There are moments where I felt like it dragged, but I'm very glad that I saw it. And if you have any interest in art or Van Gogh or this period in time or in aesthetic renaissance, you should definitely check it out. It was an enjoyable film. I think most people would enjoy it. It's a bit slower, and so you really just kind of set some time aside and watch it. If it makes any sense, it kind of felt like a nice cold day kind of movie where you're just sitting inside trying to keep warm and you want to kind of disappear into something that's very atmospheric. And that really does immerse you in this character and this other world. And so for that, I was very grateful of it. But after my Sirhan Theo Van Gogh mistake, I think this is enough of this review, and I'm going to Van Gogh fuck myself.